Bienvenidos, bienvenidas a un programa más de Praxis TV, programa de la Escuela de Filosofía de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. El día de hoy tenemos un programa muy especial para dar inicio a nuestra séptima temporada en este segundo ciclo del 2022. Y contamos con la presencia de uno de los intelectuales más importantes en la actualidad: filósofo, lingüista, activista político, profesor emérito del Instituto Tecnológico de Massachusetts, el profesor Noam Chomsky. Profesor, es un placer contar con su presencia el día de hoy y muchas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación. Adicionalmente, nos acompaña Allan González Estrada, director de la Escuela de Filosofía, quien el día de hoy nos ayudará con la interacción y la traducción para realizar este programa. Y también utilizaremos el chat de Zoom para poder dar mayor fluidez en algunos momentos. Allan, ¿cómo estás? Y muchas gracias por las gestiones para poder realizar esta entrevista.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Y nuevamente, it's a real pleasure to have Professor Chomsky with us today in this program. So we can continue with the interview as we're talking about. The first question was, what was the situation, or what are the societies are more vulnerable to fascism today than it were 100 years ago? And Chomsky was giving us some explanation about it. Okay, Professor, so we can continue. We have, what is the, in general terms, the political situation in the world today?
So start with the question, are contemporary societies more vulnerable to fascism today than 100 years ago?
Exactly.
Well, go back. I can't quite go back 100 years, but I can go back 90 years and more. So I remember the 1930s very well. In fact, some of my earliest memories are listening to Hitler's speeches on the radio at the Nuremberg rallies, not understanding the words, but grasping the mood and the reaction of the crowds. My first article happened to be in 1939, after the fall of Barcelona, was about the spread of fascism over Europe, which at the time seemed inexorable, spreading over the world. At that time, the United States was an exception. The United States pioneered modern social democracy with the New Deal. It was standing apart from the movement in Europe, Asia, with Japan, to move towards fascist societies. It's pretty ironic for someone my age to look at today, when Europe is holding on to at least the relics of social democracy. They're in tatters, but they're still there. Costa Rica, another example. And the United States is leading the way towards fascism. We see it very clearly. You can take a look at the news that's coming out about Dallas, Texas today. In Dallas, there's a major meeting of it's called the Conservative Political Action Conference. It's actually the core of the Republican Party, the part of the Republican Party that's dominated by Donald Trump, overwhelming majority of the party, very likely to take Congress in November. They already control the judiciary, may come back and take the presidency. It's a pro-fascist meeting. The first speaker, the person who's most acclaimed, is Viktor Orban, from Hungary, who has created what he calls an illiberal democracy. He's condemned all over Europe, lauded here. His speech was an illiberal democracy means that he destroyed the independent media, destroyed the political system, destroyed the universities, independent research, all under his basically unilateral control. And he's moving forward to establish what he basically calls a Christian nationalist government controlled by the maximal leader. It's a kind of soft fascism. Doesn't have death camps, but it's eliminated the independent structures of a democratic society. Well, that's the model. Former President Trump will be giving a speech lauding Orban as a herald of what we should look forward to in the future. The leading television personality in the United States, Tucker Carlson, virtually worships him. It's being presented by the Republican Party as the ideal to which we want to go. And in fact, it's exactly what they're doing. They're the states that have Republican legislatures are moving to institute rules and regulations which will enable them to become a permanent governing party, even though they're a minority party. They have always been a minority party in recent years, but because of structural features of the American system, the much greater weight given to rural counties, other things, radically undemocratic character, the Senate, the far right has an inordinate control over the state legislatures, far beyond their votes. And they're using it to institute measures which will keep them in power indefinitely. Supreme Court, which is now very reactionary, is moving in the same direction. They are going out of their way to take up cases which could allow state legislatures to ignore the vote and to select their own electors. US has an electoral college system which has always just been mechanical. The electors follow the vote, but this conception that they're bringing out of the woodwork would allow them to overturn the vote. At the end of Trump's term, he passed issued a very significant directive, presidential directive. It enables the president to select the top members of the civil service. Now, in any functioning democracy, the civil service, the bureaucrats who basically run the country, are nonpartisan. That's the basis for democracy. It's been established in law in the United States since the 19th century. Trump's executive order overthrew it. Well, when Biden came into office, he reversed it. Now in Congress, there are efforts to pass legislation which would prevent it. Democrats are all for it, Republicans are opposed. And the court may very well agree to it in the next term. Step after step is being taken to undermine formal democracy and to institute the kind of illiberal democracy, proto-fascism that Orban represents. Well, that's very dangerous, not just for the United States, but for the world. The United States is not a minor country. Latin America knows this quite well. It's the most powerful country in world history. What the United States does will determine substantially what happens in the world. So we're facing a very difficult moment in this regard.
And in this picture, Professor, what is the role of mass media? They lost legitimacy or still as a tool for democracies?
Do you want me to comment on the mass media?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So in this picture, what is the role of the mass media? Have they lost legitimacy? Are they still a tool for democracies? Well, first of all, they were not really a tool for democracies. The mass media tend to support power systems. They are important. They do significant work. First thing I do in the morning is read the New York Times, the Washington Post, turn to other mass media, but without illusions. Reporters do courageous, honest work. It's a source of information, but it's shaped and framed within a fairly narrow doctrinal system. This is not a novel observation. By now, there's thousands of pages of documentation demonstrating it, but it was already pointed out by George Orwell 80 years ago. I'm sure you've read Animal Farm. Everybody's read it. Almost nobody has read the introduction to Animal Farm. The reason was it was suppressed, was found many years later in his unpublished paper. You can now find it in some of the new editions of Animal Farm. The introduction is addressed to the people of England, free England. He says the book is a satire about the totalitarian enemy, but the people of England shouldn't feel so self-righteous because in free England, I'm now quoting him, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. Goes on to discuss some examples, some measures. The main one, he says, is if you're integrated into the culture, you accept the basic culture, you have a good education, you went to Cambridge and Oxford, you have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. I can add, even to think. That's a sophisticated propaganda system, not the kind you have in totalitarian states, which is so crude and vulgar that everyone can see it's all lies. The Western propaganda systems are more subtle. They give a certain spectrum of discussion, which gives the impression that they're free and open, but in fact, it's within a narrow and rigid doctrinal framework. If you're outside it, you're excluded. So it's very effective as imposing doctrinal systems. Could give examples, there are many in print. Well, turning to the mass media, they have been losing legitimacy. They are, to an extent, a limited extent, tool for democracies, but they're losing that. They're losing legitimacy, but that's part of something much broader. It's not just the media. All institutions are losing legitimacy. If you look at polls, faith in institutions is declining across the board. Keep to the United States, which I know best, but it's happening everywhere. Faith in the political system, Congress, judicial system, corporate system, media, science, all institutions is declining. Maybe the army is one exception, but in fact, it's across the board. That we might ask for the reasons for that. I think there's a pretty straightforward reason. It's what has happened to the population for the last 40 years. For 40 years, the general population has been subjected to a serious assault, which has undermined the social order, which has left people angry, resentful, precarious existence. The attack is called neoliberalism, which is basically a form of class war. There's nice rhetoric about the market, but nobody believes that. The system is fundamentally a system of brutal class war. And you can see the effects. The United States is very well studied. A year ago, the Rand Corporation, the highly regarded quasi-governmental corporation, did a study to ask about the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, that's the middle class and the working class, transfer from them to the top 1%. Their estimate is about $50 trillion in the last 40 years. That's quite significant. That's major effective class war, robbery of the general population for the super rich in the corporate sector. And it's left an imprint on the society. Another facet of this program was to destroy the means of self-defense. So Reagan, Thatcher, when they initiated these programs, their first actions were to undermine and destroy the labor movement. The labor movement has been traditionally the main force by which ordinary people can organize to protect themselves. If we go back to the 1930s, the New Deal in the United States rose on the back of a militant labor movement, CIO organizing, other activities, militant labor actions, sympathetic administration. That's what led to social democracy. So Reagan and Thatcher were quite wise to destroy the labor movement when they were launching a major class war against the population. Don't want them to be able to defend themselves. Now we see it all over. I mean, some of the data are just startling. So the United States is the only country in the world where mortality is increasing. That doesn't happen in modern societies, except in a war or pestilence. And here's a society that's functioning. Mortality is going up, and it's among white, mostly male, working class people. Economists call it deaths of despair. People have just given up. Everything's gone. Their lives are collapsing. That's neoliberal globalization. It's designed to enrich the very rich, the corporate sector. Everyone else hangs out to dry. The majority of them, if you go back to, say, the 1970s, the United States was very much like other OECD countries, advanced developed societies. If you take things like the cost of healthcare, the outcomes of healthcare, rate of incarceration, other measures, the United States was pretty much within the norm. Now it's off the charts. I mean, and take healthcare. In terms of cost of healthcare, it's about twice as high as the other industrial countries. The outcomes are among the poorest, the worst, way off the chart. Incarceration is shot up to the stratosphere, 5 times as high as other industrial societies. People have to arm themselves. You want to go to a school, the teacher has to be armed, and the doors have to be barred and guarded because of gun violence, which is rampant all over the country. Country's falling apart. Well, that's the result of successful neoliberalism. It's had similar effects elsewhere. Latin America led to 2 decades of what are called lost decades, 80s and 90s. Development ceased under structural adjustment programs. Elsewhere in the world, similar effects. So we have a collapse of the social order. People are easy prey to demagogues. of the Orban, Trump, Bolsonaro variety, see them around the world, does make the societies susceptible to a kind of proto-fascism. And the media have lost legitimacy. One of the elements of the right-wing onslaught is to condemn the media as purveyors of what's called false news. The only facts are those that we invent. They're even called alternative facts. Trump administration said, we create alternative facts. That's the truth. Those things you read there are just fake news. You read the newspapers, they say, I lost the election. But of course, I won the election. Of course. How could I lose? 70% of Republicans believe him. 50% of Republicans literally believe that the Democratic Party is run by sex perverts who are trying to turn children to groom children for perversion. That's half the Republican Party. If you take really serious issues, take the most serious issue we face, destruction of the environment. We don't do something about that, we're finished. Nothing else is going to matter. Well, there was a recent study by Yale University, does the main monitoring of public attitudes on global warming. A couple of days ago, they came out with their latest study. The study was designed to present to people 29 major issues and ask, how do these issues rank in determining your vote in the November election? Global warming was one of them. Among moderate Republicans, it ranked 28th out of 29. Among the mainstream of Republicans, 29. It's only the most important issue to have arisen in human history. But that's what they hear from their leaders. Say it's a hoax, it's a liberal hoax, don't believe it, don't believe those scientists, they don't know what they're talking about. Just believe us, our leaders, your leaders. Donald Trump, the rest of the Republican leadership, 100% denialist. It's not happening. That has nothing to, if it's happening, it has nothing to do with humans. Forget it. Just use maximum fossil fuels as much as you want. That's the good life. And doesn't matter what happens in the future. Well, that's the Republican Party. Not that the Democrats are that much better, but they're not that crazy. But it's a general collapse of social order, which is inherent in the neoliberal programs. When Margaret Thatcher said, there's no society, just individuals cast on the market, that's what it means. And of course, she was lying. She knows perfectly well there's a very rich, dense society for the rich and the powerful. They have chambers of commerce, trade associations, all sorts of dense arrangements by which they buttress themselves, and they control the government, which bails them out if they get into any trouble. So for the rich and powerful, very rich, very powerful society supporting them. For the rest, tough luck. Go out in the market and see if you can survive. Well, that's what happens, what we're seeing.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Profesor Chomsky. Vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa en el programa y ya regresamos para continuar hablando sobre estos temas. Un par de temas también que tenemos, no solo sobre esto que hablábamos ya de medios o que nos conversaba el profesor sobre los medios de comunicación, sino también sobre el papel que juega la filosofía en la actualidad. Ya regresamos a Praxis TV.
¿Te has preguntado alguna vez qué es la filosofía? Bueno, la filosofía es la búsqueda del conocimiento de todas las cosas. Del mundo, de la naturaleza, del ser humano. Es ir en búsqueda de la verdad. La filosofía se compone de distintas áreas que de manera crítica intentan analizar las relaciones entre los seres humanos, las relaciones con otras criaturas, la forma como conocemos y cómo razonamos sobre el mundo.
La filosofía política reflexiona sobre diversos temas fundamentales para la convivencia humana: la libertad, la justicia, el gobierno, la igualdad, la democracia, los derechos. Se cuestiona cuándo un gobierno es legítimo y cuáles son sus obligaciones ante la ciudadanía y cuáles son nuestras obligaciones ante el gobierno y ante los demás. Pero no solo reflexiona sobre estos temas, sino que tiene una participación activa dentro de los debates, dentro de las discusiones que se dan en la esfera pública, que tengan que ver con estos temas y con otros que se relacionen con la convivencia misma entre las personas. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas de nuevo a Praxis TV, programa de la Escuela de Filosofía de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Nos acompaña hoy Allan González, director de la Escuela de Filosofía, y un invitado muy especial que no requiere mucha presentación, el filósofo estadounidense Noam Chomsky. Nos estaba conversando el profesor Chomsky entre las preguntas anteriores sobre el escenario político actual y la pérdida de legitimidad de los medios de comunicación. Y la idea es continuar un poco ahora, Allan, sobre el tema del discurso, bueno, el conocimiento científico. Y ante este escenario político y social, si nos puede ofrecer algún tipo de salida, antes de volver a otro par de cuestiones más. Entonces, Allan.
Okay, Professor Chomsky, here are the two questions. What is does scientific knowledge can offer a way out?
What's the role of
social, political?
a scientific knowledge offer a way out of the social and political picture? Scientific knowledge offers a way out of the major problem that we face, namely destruction of the environment. Again, if we don't deal with that, nothing else matters. We are moving to a situation where the planet will be unlivable for humans. We're moving towards it's called a hothouse Earth. Maybe temperatures will be 3 to 4 degrees Celsius above what we now have. It's uninhabitable. It's already beginning to happen in many parts of the world. So suppose you're a peasant in India. 90% of the population in India, over 1 billion people, don't have air conditioners. 90%. The temperature in parts of India is reaching 50 degrees Celsius. And it's very humid. Try to survive that. You can't. And it's going to get worse. Same in Pakistan. Large parts of the Middle East and Africa are going to be unlivable. Take where I live in the United States, Southwest United States. There's an unprecedented drought. Been nothing like it in history. The rivers are drying up. Densely populated area. Well, it's a rich country, so you can still do something about it, but not for long. We keep the Arctic is heating much faster than the rest of the world. It's a small part of the globe, but it's critically important. Scientists tell us this and have plenty of evidence. It determines what happens to ocean flows, to the jet stream. It has a major factor in determining the weather all over the world. It's collapsing. Well, what does science tell us about this? It tells us that we have ways to overcome the crisis. We don't have a long time. There's a window of opportunity in which we can use the scientific knowledge that we have to overcome the crisis. Here we turn to the social and political picture. That's not dealing with it. It's refusing to accept the overwhelming consensus of scientists. Scientists can't do anything about that. I mean, scientists are becoming so desperate, they're chaining themselves to big buildings, trying to get somebody to pay attention. Political leaders won't do it. Institutions don't respond. Fossil fuel companies, which have enormous, extraordinary profits, don't know what to do with them, are demanding more production. Now they are so powerful, they're compelling governments to support them. The banks can make money tomorrow that way. The institutions are completely refusing to deal with what the scientific world tells them. Well, that's up to the public. Only an organized, active, engaged public can break the dysfunction of the social and political institutions so that they can listen to the scientists, take the actions that have to be taken to save us from our foolishness. Otherwise, we will be living in the twilight of human existence on Earth. It's as simple as that. I think it's the same as what it's been for 2,500 years. We go back to the origins of Western philosophy, classical Greece. Delphic oracle produced a message. The message of the Delphic oracle was, know thyself. That was intended as an individual injunction. Individuals should know themselves. We now know it should be interpreted differently. We now know what the Greeks didn't know. All human beings are very much alike. We're a new species. We have just emerged a couple 100,000 years ago. That's the flick of an eye in evolutionary time. We're all genetically almost the same. There's very little diversity among humans. So we should therefore interpret the Delphic oracle collectively, find out what kind of creatures we are. We can then turn to the person who the oracle regarded as the wisest person, Socrates. He regarded himself as knowing nothing, but he was considered the wisest person, the founder of modern philosophy. And what did he do? He went around the streets of Athens asking difficult questions, asking people to think. Do you believe something? Do you have any basis for it? Turned out they almost never did. He encouraged them to think for themselves, find answers for the serious problems that matter for human lives. His answers don't work for us, but the questions were correct. And that's been the role of philosophy ever since. Try to find out what kind of creatures are we? Ask the hard questions. Encourage people to think, to borrow Ludwig Wittgenstein's formula to philosophers, find your way out of the fly box. You're caught in beliefs and doctrine, dismantle them, tear the fly box apart, find the answers for yourselves jointly with others. That's been the role of philosophy at its best for 2,500 years. I can't think of a higher vocation.
And the other question, Professor, is right. How do you see Latin America in the political and social role in the world?
Well, let's start with Mexico. There's a famous aphorism in Mexico, a slogan, which says, which I'm sure you know, says Mexico's problem is that it's too close to the United States and too far from God. Well, too far from God as a metaphor means internal problems that we haven't solved. That's Latin America's dilemma. Too close to the United States, severe internal problems. I don't have to run through the history. You know it as well or better than I do. But the power of the United States has devastated Latin America and continues to. Latin America has to extricate itself from them. It began to do so in recent years with CELAC, for example, which was an effort to the Caribbean and Latin American countries to form an independent organization free from the control of the United States as the OAS is. It didn't get very far. The United States was able to crush it. Could be revived. UNASUR in South America was a similar effort, backed off. Well, can Latin America move in this direction? Possibly. There are moves. New president, the Petro government in Colombia, Boric in Chile, possible return to power of Lula in Brazil could lead Latin America in a more independent direction. What about the internal problems? They are very serious. There have been interesting studies of comparing Latin America and East Asia, a very revealing contrast. You go back 50 or 60 years, East Asia was mostly on a par with Africa. South Korea was like Ghana. Well, South Korea has undergone, and East Asia generally, have undergone what's called an economic miracle. South Korea is now one of the major industrial countries of the world, also overthrew its dictatorship, moved towards a democratic system. Same happened in Taiwan, same has beginning to happen in Indonesia, Malaysia, in fact, just about every country of the region, except for the Philippines. And now we're back to Mexico. Philippines is the one country that's an American colony, the one country that has not joined the East Asian miracle. How did it happen? East Asia followed the Japanese model of development, not the World Trade Organization model, the Japanese model, state-directed investment, control of capital. Capital control was strictly under state regulation. Imports were capital goods, targeted investment, very successful. It's pretty much the way England developed, the United States developed, Germany developed, Japan developed, all the developed countries. If you go back in history, Adam Smith, great economist, recommended to the United States in 1776 that it should follow the principle of comparative advantage. The new liberated colonies should concentrate on agricultural production, produce cotton, agricultural products, furs, import your advanced technology and industrial products and import them from England, which is more advanced. Got more advanced by robbing India, but let's put that aside. At that point, He said, that way we'll all be better off. And that's the same advice that the World Trade Organization is giving to the poorer countries today. It has a record of 100% failure. Every country that's developed has violated it radically. England, the United States, European countries, Japan, East Asia. Let's go to Latin America. Let's follow the advice. But in comparison with East Asia, Latin America has enormous advantages. East Asia has almost no resources. Latin America is very rich in resources. East Asia has enemies, violence, wars. Latin America is free of all that. Nevertheless, Latin America is it's called a developing society, has not developed. East Asia has developed. Take a look at the policies, you can see why. The rich in Latin America have no responsibilities. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't pay taxes. They want to export their capital to abroad, export it abroad. You want to have a villa in southern France, have a villa in southern France. Want to send your children to Oxford and Cambridge, go ahead and do it. Imports are consumer goods, not capital goods. Goes on like this. End result, Latin America is Latin America, East Asia is East Asia. Those are internal problems. Unless Latin America can control its rich, it's not going to develop. Has radical inequality. The rich are out of control. That's so going back to the slogan for Mexico, too close to the United States, too far from independence.
Ok, tenemos que hacer una breve pausa y en breve continuaremos escuchando al profesor Chomsky. Ya regresamos a Praxis TV.
¿Te has preguntado alguna vez qué es la filosofía? Bueno, la filosofía es la búsqueda del conocimiento de todas las cosas. Del mundo, de la naturaleza, del ser humano. Es ir en búsqueda de la verdad. La filosofía se compone de distintas áreas que de manera crítica intentan analizar las relaciones entre los seres humanos, las relaciones con otras criaturas, la forma como conocemos y cómo razonamos sobre el mundo.
¿Por qué filosofía? En mi caso, yo ya había cursado una carrera en economía y una en estadística, trabajo en investigación y me di cuenta que realmente me es súper necesario desarrollar este pensamiento crítico objetivo que siento que es posible desarrollarlo dentro de la carrera de filosofía.
La filosofía me abre una puerta constante en la búsqueda del conocimiento. Me ayuda a criticar, a debatir, dialogar y argumentar. También me ayuda a ser no solo una mera espectadora del mundo, sino un ser activo, para poder descongelar los pensamientos, buscar los vacíos y luego llevar todo a la práctica.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidas de nuevo a un programa más de Praxis TV, programa de la Escuela de Filosofía de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Continuamos nuestro programa con la participación del profesor Noam Chomsky y en este último bloque, profesor, quisiéramos abordar un poco el tema de la inteligencia artificial y la ética. Y una pregunta muy interesante que nos planteaba Allan ahora fuera de cámaras, y es, ¿cuál es su reflexión ética respecto al futuro de la humanidad y cómo la inteligencia artificial podría ayudarnos a nosotros, a nosotros, a los humanos? Profesor.
Go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll begin with the ethical reflection of the future of humankind, then turn to artificial intelligence. Now let me remind you of a date, crucial date in human history. For those of my age, it's a date that's indelible in memory. August 6th, 1945. We are now just about to commemorate its 77th anniversary. Tomorrow, in fact, be the seventh anniversary. That was the date when the atom bomb was used to destroy Hiroshima. It's a date I remember very well. Two things became obvious on that date. One was that human intelligence had reached the level where it would soon be able to destroy everything. Our technical intelligence had reached the level, not quite yet, but very soon, it would be capable of total destruction. That's our technical intelligence. What about our moral intelligence? Lagged far behind. Our moral intelligence had not reached the point where it could contain that impulse. In fact, it was all very clear on that date. The bomb was dropped, people celebrated, end of the war, turned back to their next activity. Nobody bothered thinking about it anymore. That illustrated the gap between technical capacity to destroy, moral capacity to control our destructive instincts. That gap has only widened in the 77 years since. It's wider now than it was then. Far greater capacity to destroy, now not just nuclear war, also destroy the environment. Moral capacity to deal with it is lagging far behind. So the answer to the ethical reflection of the future of humankind is very straightforward. Can we close that gap between our technical capacity to destroy, our moral capacity to control that destructive instinct? Nobody knows the answer. The answer is in your hands, the hands of your generation, the next generation. They will determine the answer to the question. No way to evade it. Can't put the question aside. Put it aside, gives an answer. Put it aside, it says we can't overcome the gap. We will therefore march on to species suicide. Okay? If we can't overcome it, there could be a better world. What about artificial intelligence? Well, I happen to have been involved with artificial intelligence since its inception, the early 1950s at MIT, where I was mostly in our research lab. Since then, it's split into two different fields. One field is basically science. The other field is basically engineering. The science part of artificial intelligence was the goal of the pioneers, people like Alan Turing, founder of modern theory of computation, Herbert Simon, Nobel laureate, Marvin Minsky, friend and one of the early founders. Now, they were interested in using the technology that was available in the modern computers, the understanding that was available in the modern theory of computation, using that to see if they could come to understand human intelligence. That's science. basically became cognitive science, what's now called cognitive science. That's one direction. The other direction is engineering. Can we produce useful things? Well, that happens to be what AI is today. Overwhelmingly, it's can we produce useful things? And they do. A lot of useful things, like take Google Translate. It's useful. I want to find out what's being said in an article in Greek, let's say. I can put it into Google Translate. I get a rough translation. That's valuable. It's intellectually zero. It's just brute force, massive analysis of huge amounts of data and finding enough regularities so you can achieve some purpose. So very useful, but of no scientific interest. Some of the things in contemporary AI are both scientifically useless and useless as engineering. Those are the ones that make the headlines in the newspapers. So when you read about an excited article in the newspaper about can a computer program be sentient, be conscious, lambda, it's a bad joke. It's a joke. The program is nothing. If you feed 50 terabytes of data, astronomical amounts of data, to a couple of supercomputers and let them keep running for a while, they'll find superficial regularities. And if you look at the thing that's produced with those regularities, it'll look roughly like what a human does. Absolutely no purpose, except for wasting a lot of the energy in California. No, not on engineering use, and of no scientific interest. Well, that's the kind of AI that makes the headlines. But a lot of AI does useful things. So for example, these methods have contributed to biology by studying massive amounts of different kinds of possible proteins. They have solved some of the problems of protein folding. It's a contribution to science. It's an engineering achievement, but it turned out to be useful. What can AI do for us? Well, if it's run with sensible goals, could do a lot of things. Robots, for example, could remove the dangerous and boring work that people do. Instead of people doing dangerous and boring work, they can be freed to constructive and creative activities. That would be a great contribution. Or the robots can be used to drive people into unemployment and disaster. Now we're back to ethical decisions. How do we want to define the social and political world? That's in our hands, and that'll determine whether AI will help humans or whether it'll harm them. We might also hope to go back to the original intentions of the founders of AI and develop the study of the nature of human intelligence. Now we're back to the Delphic Oracle and Socrates. What kind of creatures are we? AI could contribute to this.
Thank you, Professor. That is our final comments.
I can really think of no better message than the one that was delivered to us at the origins of the recorded history of philosophy. Let's find out what kinds of creatures we are. Let's ask searching questions, help ourselves and others break out of doctrinal rigidity, face the crucial questions that we must face if we're going to survive. Most crucially of all, the question of whether we can overcome the gap that separates our technical competence to destroy from our moral competence to control that destructive instinct and to work towards a much better world. That's the message we should all have first and foremost in our minds.
Thanks a lot,
Profesor Chomsky, muchas gracias. Thank you very much por participar en nuestro programa. Y bueno, encantados con su participación. Le agradecemos muchísimo. Igual, Allan, por las gestiones. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, esperemos que sea del agrado de todos y todas. Hoy terminamos el programa.
Sorry, I have to leave.
Yeah,
Off to the next appointment.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bueno, y hoy nos vamos con esta agrupación costarricense Kawe Calypso y esto que se llama Kawe Band. Hasta la próxima.
Calypso is a music sound sweet. I love the rhythm, so I love the beat. So anywhere you are on your feet, and you dance with the music all through the week, then I shout to
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
This is a rhythm from Trinidad, where the mighty sparrow is the dad. Also then we hear it in Panama, where the great Lord Cobra, he was the boss, and we shout
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
So then Calypso come to Limon, where you had Pitung and Papatung. So when the music started to sound, the whole and then the young breaking down the town, and we ball
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
But when you want to hear Calypso, Kawita is the town you must go to listen our father of Calypso. Nobody else but the great mighty Segundo Gavit Boy.
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
Calypso must be up on the shelf. We need our government to give us help. We want the culture music to life, because it is a way that we must survive and we follow.
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
This is a rhythm what sounds so sweet. I love the rhythm also I love the beat. So anywhere you hear it you say Calypso is the music I love today, and we ball.
Calypso and Kawita with the Kawe Band. I want the people to understand. Everywhere the violin play the Calypso just with.
Yes, Calypso and we must unite. We don't supposed to stop till the fight. Jah give us health and he give us strength. Also he gave us intelligence that we must.
Calypso and Kawe with the Kawe Band. I want my people to understand. On the way the boy them play the Calypso just with a band.
Calypso must be up on the shelf. We need our government to give us help. We want the culture, music alive, because it is the way that we can survive and we ball.
Calypso and Kawe with the Kawe Band. I want my people to understand. On the way the boy them play the Calypso just with a band. Calypso and Kawe with the Kawe Band. I want my people to understand. On the way the boy them play the Calypso just with a band. Calypso and Kawe with the Kawe Band. I want my people to understand. On the way the boy them play the Calypso just with a band.